The Green Princess. The phase rifle barked angrily, and a brutal kick of white-hot energy hit the creature hard in the center of its chest. Everything was still and silent for a moment. Then, with a slow, concluding lurch, its great tentacled head hit the ground. "Carter, you know you're scheduled to leave in 5 minutes, right?" Carter flipped his eyes up from the vintage comic book to the imposing figure of his next-door neighbor, Rogers, in his doorway. After a cold, even look, followed by an ingenious combination of smile and sneer, he slipped the beast from beyond the stars back onto the shelf behind his head and scooped up his helmet from the table, all executed without once breaking eye contact with his hulking co-worker. "You're lucky you've got me here to keep you from losing this goddamn job, you shave monkey," Rogers quite accurately pointed out. Carter flipped him the bird and sauntered out the door. As soon as he was in the corridor, he adjusted his gait into something more akin to a trot. 4.5 minutes later, he had arrived at the bike dock. This was to be his first mission post-break. He had just completed his annual 2-week vacation, spending that time, as he spent almost all his downtime, absorbed in his comic book collection. It's not like travel was a viable option. He had already traveled 14 light-years to get here, and although a trip back home to Earth wasn't out of the question, even with the space-time fold gates, it would take almost the entire 2 weeks just to get there and back, and the living quarters on those transports were hardly any improvement on the already Spartan living conditions here on the base. Carter's comic collection was exclusively sci-fi, and for the most part consisted of titles from the 1950s, Planet Comics, Super Science Stories, Galaxy, Captain Science, Amazing Stories, and the like. None of these were originals, of course. Even the few later comics he owned, such as 2000 AD and Metal Hurlant, no longer existed in their original paper form. No amount of chemical treatment or hyperbaric storage could keep that original, low-quality paper intact for the time that had passed since they had first graced the shelves of comic book stores and newsagents, their bold covers promising colourful, adventure-filled futures to young people, now long, long dead. His copies were just that, copies. Printed on synthetic paper, but, according to the various virtual stores he frequented to order them, having all the qualities, look, feel, smell, of the real McCoys. He'd have to take their word for it. "Cutting it fine, aren't you?" Phillips, the flight supervisor, shouted without looking up from his light pad. A tall, angular man, Phillips always conjured in Carter's mind the image of a grey praying mantis, hunched over in the act of consuming a clipboard. He was about 30 feet away on the other side of the square grey dock. 10 atmosphere bikes were lined up between the two men, all facing the imposing slate-coloured doors that separated this garage-like space from the rolling alien landscape outside. Carter again settled into a saunter and headed casually in Phillips's direction. He allowed his hand to brush over the lined-up shiny red nose cones of the bikes as he approached. Despite their now well-used appearance, these machines were beautiful pieces of engineering. Similar in many respects to the muscular, high-powered road bikes that had been so popular on Earth up until the point when they were lifted from the tarmac up into the clouds a few decades ago, courtesy of ever-restless human ingenuity. They looked at a glance like great cats crouched low, ready to pounce. 15 feet in length, the rider sat close to the front, hunched down like a jockey in a gallop. From this position, it felt as if the bike disappeared from beneath you, and through the wide, clear visor of the helmet, the view was that of one flying completely unaided. It was an exhilarating sensation to ride one of these wonders. Even after 22 months of endless recon missions, he still felt a giddy rush of undiluted pleasure every time he shot out into the sky like a human arrow. If it wasn't for the sitting around between flights and the dour, functional grey aesthetic of the base, he'd pay them to do this job. Well, almost. He and his fellow pilots performed their reconnaissance missions every 4 hours around the clock. They headed out 2 at a time in opposite directions in order to execute an entire sweep of the surrounding environment. This planet was, as far as could be ascertained by the scans and surveys performed before establishing the base, devoid of any fauna and only sparsely graced by flora in the form of flat greenish-grey bushes that spotted the landscape like overgrown earth lichen. Nevertheless, it was company practice to maintain these manned sweeps in conjunction with the tireless scanning of the automated perimeter modules, just to be on the safe side. On the scores of planets that had been explored over the years of establishing these support bases for the OSTFGs, orbiting space-time fold gates, very few animal life forms had been found. Most impressive among these was an entirely vegetarian, albeit overgrown, version of the common earth tick, and an assorted range of quite uninspiring microscopic jelly worms. Meagre pickings indeed. Nevertheless, if by some unexpected turn of events someone did come knocking, they'd prefer to be ready for company. Carter was about to address the flight supervisor when he was cut short. "Go and get a coffee or something, Carter. We're ironing out a glitch in the bike's tracking unit." "I can confirm my coordinates over the comlink as we go, if you like," Carter offered. "Oh, I prefer seeing your little blip on my screen, Carter. Wouldn't want you taking off with my sweetheart here and never coming back." Carter snorted in amusement. "Yeah, might fly on out there into the sunset and just keep going. Always wanted to take a honeymoon on a wasteland with an atmosphere bike to curl up with at night." "Yep, that's what I figured," Phillips replied and shooed him away without once having looked up from his light pad. Carter well knew that Phillips was no people person, but hell, the guy's mastery of the art of being an arsehole sometimes left him completely lost for words. He swung around and headed for the refreshments bench. "You know, coffee actually doesn't sound like too bad an idea," he thought to himself. He popped the top off the coffee canister and poured the ground beans into the espresso module. Pushing the module forward so he could read the side-mounted option buttons, it must have caught on something sticky. It flipped over, sending water and coffee grounds all over the grimy grey bench. Damn it! He could see the whole thing happen in slow motion, but just couldn't react in time to be any more than an observer to the sudden splash and spread of cold water and coffee before him. "I like your style, Flash," came a voice from behind. Sarah Springer. "Yep, I know," he responded over his shoulder, while pulling wads of paper towel out of the dispenser to mop up his little disaster. "That looks good. Fix me one too while you're at it." He decided to ignore her. Sarah was flying the other leg of this sweep. They would be leaving at the same time, him breaking off in one direction, her in the other. If forced, he would have to admit that he enjoyed her company well above that of anyone else here, even in spite of her tendency to rib him mercilessly. Sometimes this kind of playful antagonism is flirting, and sometimes it's born of genuine amusement at the ineptitude of its target. He felt pretty sure, in this case, it was the latter. It didn't matter. He certainly found her attractive, long blonde hair, freckles, an easy smile, and lively blue-grey eyes. But even if she had seemed interested, he wouldn't go there. Relationships on the base were best taken seriously or avoided altogether. It was too close an environment to have someone who thought you're a piece of shit bumping into you every couple of hours, and he knew, if his previous relationships were anything to go by, that this was a very probable outcome. Anyway, his tastes ran to the more exotic, and those kinds of women, he was pretty certain, only lived in 1950s pulp imaginings. A more successful second attempt at finding his inner barista, a quick shuffle into flight gear, followed by another disparaging remark from Springer and a dismissive look from Phillips later. And he was flying. This was more like it. The grey sand and vegetation slipped away briskly beneath him as he drilled forward into the pink and orange sky. He enjoyed the familiar, giddy lurch in his stomach as he punched up into top gear and gave the bike full throttle. He checked his instruments. Everything looks tickety-boo, he thought to himself. He had no idea how this expression had slipped into his lexicon, but he knew it had some connection with English aircraft pilots from a long time ago back on Earth, and something about it tickled him. It wasn't long before the mountain range he would be banking to the right against and following for the next half hour began to loom into sight. While the sandy plain on which the base had been constructed was about as uninspiring a landscape as he could imagine, these mountains were anything but. With sheer faces of dark olive-green rock, interspersed with great swathes of black crystals that reflected brilliant purple as they caught the light, these mountains were a sight to behold. The crystals ranged from the dimensions of children's fingers to the size of fully grown men. Of no particular use in a mineralogical sense, they were still things of striking beauty. Their bristling points raced by on his left side, dazzling his eyes with energetic, dancing, geometric flashes of purple. A few minutes into this leg of his sweep, and something on the bike's display panel caught his eye. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the absence of something caught his eye. Half his instrumentation had died. He still had what he needed to maintain control of the bike: airspeed, altitude, turn and slip, position tracking, but it looked like the connection with the base had glitched out. He tested his comlink. "Hey, Phillips, you still reading me back there?" "Well, funny you should mention that," came the reply. "I'm hearing you, but I don't have your position anymore." "Yeah, I thought that might be the case." "I thought I'd fix that damn module. Piece of shit." "Well, I don't think swearing is going to make you any better an electrical engineer, old boy." "Fuck you." "Sounds like you're willing to give it a try, though." There was a pause. Phillips's irritation was palpable, and Carter smiled to himself, suppressing an amused snort that he knew would tip Phillips over the edge into a full rage. "Listen, Carter, you just finish your sweep and be back here within the hour. Can you do that without me holding your hand?" "Anything for you, old boy. You can practice your soldering while I'm gone." "You fuck!" Carter hit the rescan button on his comlink, and Phillips was cut off. On he flew. It felt good being out here without someone tracking his every movement. The sense of rocketing over this alien landscape, unassisted and unobserved, made him feel like the hero in one of those wonderful comics. He was a space traveler piloting a real rocket bike on a real alien planet, and adventure was as inevitable as his ultimate triumph over whatever unearthly threat awaited him. He felt a shiver up his spine and a little spike of pleasure as he allowed the bike to veer ever so slightly from the predetermined route. Goosebumps. He had goosebumps. "What are you doing?" he thought to himself. "Boldly going forth into unknown worlds," was the reply that jumped into his head. And with that he banked hard to the right, swung out in a great arc, and pointed the nose of his bike at the great wall of green, black, and purple in front of him. The bike surged forward like a mighty steel horse leaping a crevasse, and just as the mountainside loomed up fatally in his path, he pulled back hard, sending the bike and himself exploding up the sheer face in a great dizzy lurch. The mountain dropped from beneath him, and he was sailing high in a magnificent parabola through the breathtaking orange and pink expanse. On and on he flew. As the mountain range disappeared behind, new terrain revealed itself. The great black crystals he was so familiar with were far more prevalent here, and far more impressive. The size of tall trees, and in some areas so dense that they took on the appearance of glimmering black forests. Strange, tall pillars of red earth began appearing, looking for all the world like tremendous termite mounds. They dwarfed the mighty black crystals. He checked to see if the life sign monitor was still operating. It was. He felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment to see that nothing appeared to be alive in the extraordinary environment he was speeding over. The great red skyscraper-like pillars sure looked like the place to find some highly evolved race of insect warriors awaiting the arrival of a long-prophesied chosen one from the sky. Not this time, it would seem. His reverie was interrupted by a curt voice. "Carter, location report." It was Phillips. "Yep, on approach vector, might be a little late. Did a couple of return sweeps to check on suspected anomalies." "Anything to report?" Phillips replied. "Nope, business as usual out here on the prairie." "Whatever that means. Just let me know when you're on final approach, all right?" "You got it." As he said this, a green dot beeped into life on the life sign monitor. He breathed in sharply and punched up the menu for the coordinate display. That was when he hit the topmost point of the enormous red pillar that had begun looming up towards him the moment after he spotted the green blip. He never even saw what had torn the underside of his bike away. The powerful machine snapped around into a deadly spin, plummeting towards the black forest of crystals below. He saw nothing but whirling orange, red, green, purple. Black. Carter awoke into a world of pain and thirst. All around him were crazed angles of cold black crystal, broken pieces of the atmosphere bike, and his own blood, covering him and the shattered obsidian that lay in confusion around him. How long had he been lying here, a discarded rag doll amongst all this breakage? It soon became apparent that he too was broken. He tried to move and found himself entirely incapable. With a grunt of pain, he managed to look down his contorted body towards his legs. Both were clearly broken in a number of places. A sharp white point of broken femur poked through his riding pants on the left-hand side. He only had a moment to process this awful vision before he slipped back into merciful, ebony nothing again. The second time he awoke, he was lying on his side in what he knew to be recovery position. Still unable to move, he suspected that, in addition to his legs, his back, and possibly even his neck, were broken. Nevertheless, he could raise his eyes upward, and he saw that he was lying on the floor of a modestly sized cave, with his head pointing towards the mouth of the cavern. Stars were visible through the entranceway, and the ever-present umber glow that permeated the night sky here, creating a cast like that of a children's nightlight. This allowed one to see reasonably well even in the middle of the night, which he assumed this to be. The pain was still palpable, but he felt a little less racked in torment, almost as if he had been slipped a handful of pain blockers. The thirst was better too. He figured these happy developments probably signified he was in a worse, rather than better, state. As consciousness began to slip away again, he feebly groped at the question of how he had come to be moved, but like a patient going under general anesthesia, the thought slipped greasily through his fingers as he sank backwards into warm, velvet nothing. Again he awoke, It was daylight outside now, and he looked up to see the orange and pink cloudless canopy framed by the black entrance of his refuge. Why am I still alive? He wondered to himself. Movement was still denied him, but his pain had certainly lessened yet again, and he felt neither thirsty nor hungry. Someone is taking care of me, he concluded. But who? He racked his brain, trying to remember anything at all that might throw some light onto this mystery. He came up empty-handed. He lay there through the rest of the day, drifting in and out of awareness, until finally he awoke to find himself in the warm glow of night again. At first he only opened his eyes very slightly. Through his obscuring eyelashes he made out a patch of green, not the rich olive green of so much of the rock in this world, but a light, fresh green, like that of leaves translucently illuminated by sunlight. He opened his eyes fully, and there she was, breathtakingly beautiful. Smooth green skin, long red hair, almond eyes with iridescent purple irises surrounding deep black pupils. She had the figure of an old-style bathing suit model, full hips, tiny waist, long athletic limbs. Her outfit did actually resemble a bathing suit, but was fashioned from bright gleaming silver, sculpted to fit perfectly to her curves in voluptuous metallic imitation of the alluring form beneath. Her outfit was completed by large rounded silver bracelets on each wrist, and thigh-high boots in some type of silver fabric that clung tightly to her shapely legs. She was, in a word, perfect. Even in the gloom of the cave, he could see her very clearly. It was as if she radiated her own illumination. She was, quite simply, the most beautiful and wonder-inspiring sight he had ever seen. He suddenly realized that he was staring slack-jawed, and quickly hazarded a smile. Those soft green lips of hers curved into a warm, welcoming smile in return. It reminded him of the morning sun breaking slowly over the sea, a steady golden unfolding of warmth and reassurance. His own smile broadened into a wide, silly grin. Despite his unfortunate circumstances, he was pretty certain that this was the happiest he had ever felt. "Did you bring me here?" he eventually managed. His voice was hoarse with disuse, but she appeared to understand him and nodded slowly. He found he was simply staring again. What? Where did you come from? Who are you?" Again she nodded. Perhaps she didn't understand him after all. She walked towards him. Even her gait was a thing of wonder, some impossible combination of exotic dancer and princess. He found it hard to believe anyone could have such grace. She bent over him. The intoxicating symmetry of her face was closer now, and even more beautiful at this intimate distance. She reached her elegant hand towards his forehead like an angel in an annunciation, and suddenly he was asleep again. He awoke to daylight streaming in through the cave's mouth. Alone. Had he dreamt her? He must have. But that being the case, how did he come to be in this cave? And even more baffling, why did he appear to be on the mend from injuries that, beyond a doubt, should have been fatal? He looked down along the length of his dully aching body. Dully aching, naked body. "What?" he involuntarily exclaimed aloud. Glancing about, he saw no sign of his flight gear. Well, that certainly settles it. All other miracles aside, there is no way he had managed to undress himself. He was still completely incapable of movement beyond his face, and to a lesser extent, his fingers. "Hello?" he called out as loudly as his cocoon of muted pain would allow him. No reply. He lay there through the rest of the day, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep, until finally he was again surrounded by the dull incandescence of night. He snapped awake, abruptly aware of something warm and alive pressed up against his back. He drew in a sharp intake of breath and immediately heard a soothing female voice in his ear. "Be still. I am with you. I will take care of you." "Who are you?" he replied. "I am the one who has brought you here. I am the one who heals you. I am the one you are with. Do you wish to be with me, Samuel Carter?" He started. "I didn't tell you my name. How do you know my name?" "Don't be alarmed, Samuel. I can see the entirety of the path that leads you to me. I know you, and soon you will know me. Would you like that, Samuel?" Only his mother had ever called him Samuel. Did she know that? He had to admit the thought didn't make him feel uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. He felt vulnerable but protected, like a child. "I would like that." He sighed the words. He felt her arm against his neck, her hand stroking his hair. He attempted to say more, but was overcome by the soft hammer of absolutely irresistible sleep. That night, he dreamed he was a small black stone being carried in a beautiful green hand. It enveloped him, occasionally running its fingertips over his warm contours. They were travelling somewhere together. He had never felt so happy. More days passed in this manner. He would drift in and out of consciousness throughout the day, like a post-op patient riding the waves of dreamlike consciousness and black nothingness induced by strong painkillers. Every night she was there, nuzzled up behind him, stroking him, speaking gently into his ear, and as he slept, he dreamed wonderful dreams. Time passed. Maybe a week had elapsed since his first meeting with this alluring caregiver, maybe a month. He had lost track in the endless slipping from muted lucidity to dream-filled repose. Whatever the passage of time had been, lying here in her embrace, or in the anticipation of it, finally, one evening, he awoke to find her again, standing before him. Gone were the shining silver garments. She was revealed fully to him, in all her incomparable, unveiled glory. Disrobed, she had the artful appearance of a statue from antiquity, but she was no mere nymph, muse, or Greek goddess. Even to draw comparisons with Helen of Troy would have been to sell his bewitching, magnificent saviour short. She was nothing less than perfection. He might have suspected himself of having dreamed her up, but that would, in his opinion, have been giving his imagination far more credit than it deserved. She was watching him with those luminous, exquisite eyes of hers, and, after a silent moment, she allowed the warm glow of her smile to slowly appear again. This extraordinary vision stepped towards him, and he suddenly became aware of just how good he was feeling. He had been gradually regaining strength over the preceding days, but tonight he felt incredible, vital, and as she lowered herself, sliding in one fluid motion up against his body, his ardour rose with an urgency that made his heart leap in his chest. He awoke to the sound of a gentle breeze outside. Normally so still at night, the soft breath at the mouth of the cave was like unexpected music in his ears. He felt at home. The familiar, pleasant sensation of her pressed up against his back made him smile to himself in the dull gloom. She was perfectly still. He had not experienced her asleep behind him before. It was always he who would succumb to the call of the void first, as she stroked and caressed him. Lying awake while she slept, curled up behind him, felt good. He felt a fierce animal drive to watch over her, protect her. This was it. This was love. This was... Her arm slipped down to his chest from where it had been resting against his neck, and he felt a sudden popping sensation in his left ear. He instantly felt very cold and very unwell. The cave was suddenly much darker than before, and he realized that the gentle wind outside was in fact a furious gale, howling like a wounded beast as a maelstrom whipped past the open cave. He jerked his hand up to her arm. It slid reflexively away from his grasp, wet and slippery like an enormous startled earthworm. He attempted to spring up and away from whatever clung to him in the darkness, but a powerful force came down on the side of his head and pressed him cruelly into the dirt. The next moment, he felt an awful squirming sensation pushing urgently into his ear. And then all was black again. This time he awoke within an altogether different embrace. He was encased head to foot in some type of resin, a shining swaddle of amber. The only part of him not enveloped by its tight, hard grip was his face. He squirmed within his bonds and found, to his great relief, that he was able to break free of his prison with relative ease. It cracked and fell away from him as he wriggled and flexed within. He stood up, free of the strange container, and breathed in deeply. Despite his bizarre circumstances, he felt incredible. Taking in his surroundings, he surmised that his captor had relocated him, as he was now within a far smaller grotto. She, whatever she was nowhere to be seen. In his new, invigorated state, his first thought was how to return to the base. Amazingly, he realized he hadn't given this imperative a thought during his entire time on the cave floor. He ducked down and squeezed out of his enclosure. Looking around, he saw nothing within the landscape of crystalline rock that provided any clue as to which direction to head, but, before despair could overtake him, he sensed something else, as clear and unequivocal as anything he had ever experienced. He could smell them. He could smell the people he had worked and lived with over the last 2 years, smell the exhaust of the atmosphere bikes, the aroma of food being prepared in the galley, even the grease that coated the giant hinges of the outer doors of the bike dock. He knew precisely in which direction he should head, and set off at pace, never surer of anything in his life. His energy was boundless. He ran and ran and ran. Looming black crystals flashed past him on all sides as he negotiated the terrain, springing lithely from rock to rock, and, when the topography allowed, sprinting furiously without fatigue or doubt. Eventually he reached the great sandy plain on which he knew he would find the base, and pressed on even more urgently. Accelerating, he marveled at his newfound strength, his tirelessness. Whatever she, or it, had done to heal him, it had restored him far beyond any peak of physical fitness and prowess he had known before. He felt a sense of exultation that surpassed even the rush he experienced piloting his atmosphere bike. He felt like a god. He could now see the base, only 1 or 2 kilometers away, home to all the humanity this alien planet harbored. It looked terribly small and fragile from this distance, but it was growing by the second as he powered across the sandy plain towards it. In no time at all he could make out the details of its exterior. The slate-grey doors of the dock, the strutting, the exhaust ports, the shining solar panels mounted to the roof, and figures. Yes, figures. There were maybe 10 or 12 of his fellows out front of the dock doors to greet him. "Oh boy, do I have a story to tell," he thought, grinning to himself. As he closed, he noticed something troubling. There was a defense barrier laid down between him and the others, and every single one of them was armed and aiming in his direction. It wasn't long before he heard the shouting, and before he could adjust course or pull up, a great explosion of sand erupted just to his right, followed by the unmistakable bark of a pulse rifle. He hit the deck, and a great plume of ground sprang up from where he had impacted. "What the goddamn fuck?" he thought. Why on earth was he receiving this kind of greeting? What had happened here in the time he was gone? He rose slowly and, as calmly and non-threateningly as possible, began walking towards his comrades. They certainly looked concerned. He recognized Phillips and nearly laughed out loud at the look of disconcertion on his usually undemonstrative face. Rogers was there too. He looked like he was about to shit his pants. It was Captain Peters who had fired upon him. He spotted her stony face behind the smoking business end of her pulse rifle, still aimed in his direction. Approaching steadily but submissively, he suddenly became aware of something decidedly out of whack. What he had earlier thought the oft-experienced effects of linear perspective turned out to be something much more disturbing. Everyone had shrunk. Peters, Rogers, Phillips, everyone else who had turned up to brandish a boomstick at him was, from what he could tell, about 1/3 their normal size. He stopped, his mind reeling. This doesn't make any sense, he thought. Has some strange radiation affected the entire base and crew? Why don't they recognize me? Do they even realize what's happened to them? He was sure he'd read something very similar to this in one of his beloved comics. What was the title of that story? He racked his brain. In that moment he realized that miniature Captain Peters had sprung over the defense barrier and was running towards him, shouting aggressively. He took a step backwards and saw her drop to one knee and raise the pulse rifle firmly into her shoulder. He began to open his mouth, but it was too late. He heard the phase rifle bark angrily, and a brutal kick of white-hot energy hit him hard in the center of his chest. Everything was still and silent for a moment. Then, with a slow, concluding lurch, his great tentacled head hit the ground.